Hello there and welcome to my guide for painting Red Skull, Baron Zemo and Crossbones for Marvel Zombies. As you can see, the very first thing I've done is sprayed them with some matte black spray from Colourforge. So the very first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to dry brush Crossbones and Red Skull with some Corvus Black. Then moving on to Red Skull's uniform, I'm going to paint the entire uniform with some Eshin Grey. I'm also going to use it to paint all of the pouches on Crossbones. Next, I'm going to paint Crossbones' trousers with some Skavenblight Dinge. And give everything from the Eshin Grey a wash with some Nuln Oil. Moving on to Baron Zemo and any purple on him, which is trousers, his shirt and his loincloth, I'm going to use some Naggaroth Night. And then for his mask, I'm going to use some Screamer Pink. Then both the purple and the pink will receive a wash with some Druchii Violet. While that wash dries, I'm going to go back to Red Skull and I'm going to relayer his Eshin Grey with some Eshin Grey, making sure I avoid any of the recesses. This will be then followed by a 50-50 mix of Eshin Grey and Mechanicus Standard Grey. Don't forget to also continue with Crossbones' pouches. And then finally Mechanicus Standard Grey just by itself for the last highlight. For Crossbones' trousers, we're just going to use some Storm Vermin fur. Then going back to Baron Zemo, I'm going to relayer the Naggaroth Night with some Naggaroth Night, once again making sure I avoid any of the recesses. This will then be highlighted with a 50-50 mix of Naggaroth Night and Zorus Purple. Then Zorus Purple just by itself. And then finally, and this is just for the loincloth, I'm going to use a 50-50 mix of Zorus Purple and Genestealer Purple for the last highlight. Moving on to his mask, I'm going to relayer the Screamer Pink, taking a lot of care to avoid any of the recesses. And this will be highlighted with a 50-50 mix of Screamer Pink and Pink Horror. On both of Baron Zemo's and Red Skull's bases, there is some stuff to do with Captain America, so for the blue of that, I'm going to use some Macragge Blue. And for the Cosmic Cube in Red Skull's hand, I'm going to use some Temple Guard Blue. Then all that blue will be washed with some Drakenhof Nightshade. Well, that wash dries, I'm going to work on Baron Zemo's gloves with some Avalanche Sunset. And also paint the fur on his jacket with some Wraithbone. Both these areas will then get washed with some Army Painter Soft. Moving back to the blue, I'm going to use a 50-50 mix of Macragge Blue and Calgar Blue for the first highlight. Followed by Calgar Blue just by itself. Next, I'm going to paint the Red Skull's head and his little iconography for Hydra with some Mephiston Red. Then, also don't forget to do Captain America's shield, nearly forgot that. Then I'll give that all a wash with some Carroburg Crimson. And while that wash dries, I'll start on the Cosmic Cube, and for that I'm going to use a 50-50 mix of Temple Guard Blue and a Barahoth Blue for the first highlight. This will be followed by that same mix, but at a 70-30 ratio in favour of Barahoth Blue. Then Barahoth Blue once again, but this time it's just by itself, and this is mostly an edge highlight. And then lastly a 50-50 mix of Barahoth Blue and Matte White, and this is just on the corners. Once that's done, I'm going to relayer the Avalanche Sunset on Baron Zemo's gloves, making sure I avoid any of the recesses. And to highlight, I use a 50-50 mix of Avalanche Sunset and Matte White. Then I'll very carefully dry brush the Wraithbone, relayering the fur. And this will be followed by a 50-50 mix of Wraithbone and Matte White. To paint any gold that's on Baron Zemo, I'm going to use some Retributor armor. which I'll wash with some Reichland Flesh Shade. And while that wash dries, I'll go back to Red Skull. I'm going to relayer the Mephiston Red just to neaten things up a bit, and I'm going to make sure I avoid any of the recesses. Then I'm going to use a little bit of a Baden Black to paint in his eyes. And this will be followed by matte white. I'm also going to use the matte white for Baron Zemo and Crossbones as well. And then lastly, I'll use a small dot of a Baden Black to mark the pupil on Red Skull, and only Red Skull. I'll then go back to the red. I'm going to use Evil Sun Scarlet to continue the highlights. Don't forget to do Captain America's shield as well. Then I'll use a 50-50 mix of Evil Sun Scarlet and Wild Rider Red for the final highlight. For Crossbones' arms, I'm going to use some Bugman's Glow, which I'll give a wash with some Reichland Flesh Shade. Then I'm going to use some Grey Seer to start painting the white on his mask, the crossbones, and the white on Captain America's shield. This will then be highlighted with a 50-50 mix of Grey Seer and matte white. And this will be followed by matte white just by itself for those final highlights. Then I'm going to use some Lead Belcher to paint any silver. And I'll use a little bit of Catachan Flesh to paint the strap of Captain America's shield. Then any silver will be washed with some Nuln Oil. Then going back to Crossbones' skin, I'm going to use a 50-50 mix of Bugman's Glow and Cadian Flesh Tone for the first highlight. And this will be followed by Cadian Flesh Tone just by itself. Then for a final highlight, I'll use a 50-50 mix of Cadian Flesh Tone and Kislev Flesh. To highlight any gold, I'm just going to simply relayer the Retributor armor. To highlight the silver, I'm going to use a 50-50 mix of Lead Belcher and Stormhost Silver. And this will be followed by Stormhost Silver just by itself. There's a shield logo on Baron Zemo's base, so to highlight that, I'm going to use some Corn Red. Next, I'm going to start painting the explosion behind Crossbones, and for that, I'm going to use, at the very base, some Dawn Yellow. This will then be washed with some Cassandora Yellow. Once our wash is dried, we're then going to use a 50-50 mix of Dawn Yellow and Flash Gits Yellow for the first set of sort of highlights. What we're going to do is we're going to slowly get further red, and then we're going to start to go to grey. So next we'll have Flash Gits Yellow to represent a far brighter burst. This will then be followed by a 50-50 mix of Flash Gits Yellow and Fire Dragon Bright for the next lot. This is going to start to expand as well as the explosion is sort of wider than it is. This will be followed by Fire Dragon Bright just by itself. Then a 50-50 mix of Fire Dragon Bright and Troll Slayer Orange. Once again, we're going to start just tickling the tips here, but we're also going to keep expanding. Next is Troll Slayer Orange just by itself. And then a 50-50 mix of Troll Slayer Orange and Wild Rider Red. Again, we're just sort of aiming for the edges of this explosion now. And then we're going to do a 50-50 mix of Wild Rider Red and Eshin Grey for the final sort of outer part of the explosion, especially the longer parts. Don't be afraid to get some of the sort of more larger bumps as well in the sort of rest of the explosion. Then we'll have a 50-50 mix of Eshin Grey and Corvus Black. And then finally a dry brush of Corvus Black just by itself on the sort of absolute peaks and tips. Just trying to pick out a few bits where it looks like the explosion has got a little bit more smoky. Then the rest of the bases will be then painted with some Dawnstone. There's a little bit of rebar on Crossbones base, so I'm going to use some Iron Warriors for that. Next, I'm going to dry brush all of the bases with some Karak stone. Then I'll tidy up the rims with some Abaddon black. And then finally, wash the bases with some watered down Agrax Earthshade. Once that wash has dried, that's these three out of the way. I've got to say, it's nice and simple, easy models to paint, mostly because they've got a very limited paint scheme. And because of that limited paint scheme as well, you're only looking around about 4 hours to paint all three, and it is quite a lot of fun to paint them. In fact, looking back, I think the thing that took the longest to paint was probably the explosion on Crossbones' base. Thank you so much for watching. If you followed this guide, I really do hope it helped. And if you want to see more, there's plenty more on the channel, especially Marvel Zombie stuff. I'm currently trying to get everything finished, so there's going to be paint guides for absolutely every part of the Marvel Zombies range. And if you want to see those, give the channel a subscribe. If you want to see other stuff as well, we've got other stuff too. Don't forget to give us a subscribe for those. And well, thanks again, and I'll see you on the next one. Goodbye for now.